Good evening, everybody. I am, as Rick said, Michelle DeMarion. I'm a professor emeritus at the Political Science Department at Susquehanna. And I'm very proud tonight to be with you to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Andrea Lopez, for tonight's talk. I am very happy in my semi-retirement back here in Massachusetts, but there are a lot of things I still miss from Susquehanna. One of those things was the privilege of having my very own in-office expert next door or down the hall in Steele, on whom I could always depend for advice and knowledge on a wealth of topics. I often joke that I could answer questions about the politics of one country, and I expected her to cover the other 194. And she did cover them, and she covered them well. I depended on her at all times to explain these other countries' politics to me, and I very much miss having that in-house expert. As all her former students who are with us tonight know, she's a stellar teacher and advisor and was recognized by her colleagues for this talent when she was awarded the 2019 Distinguished Academic Advising Award. Her knowledge of pedagogy and advising, however, was also a benefit to colleagues like me who always had questions for her. Her unbelievable mastery of the details of the curriculum that I could never keep straight helped me in advising more times than I can count. Dr. Lopez's expertise extends as well to her scholarly work, most notably on counterinsurgency, a topic on which she has authored numerous papers and chapters, and which was the focus in her doctoral program at the University of Michigan. It's her expertise on Russia, however, that we draw upon tonight. In the studies for her BA from the University of Virginia and her master's degree from the University of Michigan, Dr. Lopez focused on Russia and Eastern Europe. Those of us who are older might have known it as Soviet studies. And her interest in Russia has never waned, something that many students who have taken her Soviet and Russian politics class over the years know. I'm pleased tonight to be able, once again, to learn from Dr. Lopez, this time on this very important and timely topic, Ukraine and Russia on the edge of conflict.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I would say I don't really have 194 countries down, but I'm pretty good with factoids, so can get by periodically. But tonight I am going to focus on Russia and Ukraine, and I am going to share my screen so that I can call up a PowerPoint. Because I need to show maps and the like. And so today for this talk, I am going to cover a variety of different things. I'm going to start with the Russian-Ukrainian military situation, or what we can think about is the reason we are nervous right now about what might happen. I will also talk a little bit about the history of the conflict at this point. Then I'm going to talk about the reasons Russia may be doing what it's doing. And I have the perhaps because these are reasons that have been given for a lot of Russian action, but we don't really know what's in Putin's mind. We don't know what his intentions are. We don't know whether he is going to invade, whether it was ever an intention. We have no idea. And so I have question marks, there are a variety of caveats here, but I'm going to talk about these three elements in broad terms and do it more or less chronologically that are affecting Russian decision-making in foreign policy generally, but really just focusing on Ukraine here. And then I'll finish up by some of the US options, whether we should care, and what we are doing currently. A lot of you posted questions, and thank you when you registered. I'm going to try to get to many of those, just kind of in the flow of the discussion, but please throw up questions as you have them and hope to get to them at the end. I'm hoping to only take about 30 minutes to talk. We will see what happens. So starting with that Russian-Ukrainian military situation, I think number one, it's important to realize that there have been troops on the Ukrainian border between those two states since the end of the Soviet Union. The issue now is how many. Is that right now there are believed to be between 100 and 130,000 troops along the border between Ukraine and Russia on the east, on the right there, and I'm doing this from Ukraine's point of view, as well as troops in Belarus to the north. So if you are Ukraine, you are basically circled, particularly if you include some of those troops in Moldova, on most sides by Russian forces. And those forces have increased in number in the last year, again, to between 100 and 130,000. The United States says that they have information that Russia is planning to get it up to 145,000 troops in this period. One thing to note is that the troops in Belarus are, according to the Russian and Belarusian governments, there in order to engage in war games, which are scheduled for the 10th through the 20th. So they kind of try to explain that away. But there's still an awful lot of troops on this border, particularly when we think about how that compares to Ukrainian forces. So on the right side of your screen, you will see Russian measures, and on the left side, Ukrainian. Now, the Ukrainian forces are far better than they were, say, in 2014, when Russia took Crimea and the war broke out in Luhansk and Donetsk, but they are still relatively small compared to Russia, and they have relatively limited equipment. Many of the analysts of this situation are saying what really would doom the Ukrainians in a direct invasion are the fighter and attack aircraft, that the Ukrainians have very little capacity to stop that. And so they're going to be very vulnerable to a set of airstrikes. Now, that does not, of course, mean that Russia is planning this. Again, all those caveats I mentioned, but it is a reality that probably, if Russia wants, Russia can take Ukraine. The issue will be, could it hold it? But there are really, if we're just talking military at this moment, there are a kind of set of opportunities, options for the Russians. And I'm just going to pull up this map to use it both to demonstrate a couple of the options, but to just give you a sense of what we're talking about. So in 2014, I'll give you a little more of the details of the lead up to this later, but you have civil war breaking out in the far eastern part of Ukraine in the areas of, as you can see, Luhansk and Donetsk. And the red outline is basically a ceasefire line that was signed there. And so you have rebels in those areas that handily, with support of the Russian government, defeated the Ukrainian military, who was incompetent, poorly trained, low morale, all the things you do not want in your military, took that territory. In the interim, you have had about 13 or 14,000 people killed in what is basically a low-level conflict ever since that point. So you have that region that is basically self-governing. The Russian government has also provided the population with passports that say Russia on them. And so over 500,000 people in that part of the country have Russian passports. And so that enhances the legitimacy, if you will, of a Russian response to a potential attack on that population, because they are now Russians, not just Russian speakers, but Russians. And so you have this, potential for a justification for attack. You also, of course, have Crimea in the south. I'll talk more about the history of Crimea briefly in a little while, but Crimea was at the same time occupied by Russian forces and held a referendum and overwhelmingly voted to join the Russian Federation. And so it has openly Russian troops, Russian naval personnel, it has a naval base and the like in Crimea. And so you have these two regions, but as you can see, they are separated. And so one of the potential military options for Russia would be to, number one, enhance or expand the Luhansk and Donetsk area to hold a larger percentage of Russian speakers. Another, still fairly limited response might be to try to unify those two regions. And there's long been concern that that could happen, that the Russians would at least try to create a corridor between the two. You also have potential much larger scale attacks. One is the seizure of Ukraine up to, and you can see it better in this picture, the White River there, the Dnieper. And so take all that territory to the east of it. And so that would be a significant attack. You could also, in theory, have an attack that drives all the way and takes over all of Ukraine. There are a number of analysts who say this can be done. It's not going to be easy, but the Russian forces are much more advanced than the Ukrainian forces. They're much better equipped than the Ukrainian forces. And even with, say, the 145,000, that may be enough to take the country. The challenge, of course, is holding it. And this is where that counterinsurgency stuff that Michelle mentioned comes in, is that holding it is going to be really hard. And I want to throw out just a couple of comparative points to illustrate this. Ukraine is just slightly smaller than Texas. And so it is a big country. It has about 37 to 40 million people. It hasn't had a census since 2001, so it's a little fuzzy, but about 37 million people, we'll say. And so that is an awful lot of people. You have about 3 million in Kiev, and you've got a couple of other cities of over 1 million people. That militarily is a really hard thing to deal with, is urban warfare. Very bloody for both sides. And so this is going to be a challenge. And if you want to compare it to, say, previous American actions, we went in and maxed out numbers in Iraq, for example. We didn't go in this many, but later we had up to about 160,000 people in Iraq, troops in Iraq. Iraq is about 2/3 the population and about 2/3 the geographic size of Ukraine. And so, you know, it was challenging enough for us. And the terrain here is much different as well, and probably more forgiving for guerrilla fighters. Ukraine, by the way, is also working on training guerrilla fighters. It is holding a number of workshops and training camps and things for average civilians to help prepare them. This is seen very much as a deterrent effect more than necessarily a really creation of a capacity, but may be able to deter Russia. We've also been doing that, just side note, in the Baltics. The Baltic states have also been trying to teach their civilians how to engage in guerrilla warfare if the Russians were to invade. Now, all this said does not mean that Russia is planning to invade. Again, there are so many question marks. And so Russia might be planning to invade. It might be just going to be sitting on the borders to basically tire us out. That's really expensive to keep that many personnel on the borders, but to kind of tire out NATO and start to see more divisions within our members. They could engage in cyber attacks, which there have already been some in Ukraine. It could use pipelines and other economic tools to kind of ratchet up the pressure. It could, as the British have said, try to undermine the government and put in a puppet government. So there are so many other options that Russia could do, even if we do not meet its demands. So what are Russia's demands here? Russia sent in December a document, and you can hop on the Russian Foreign Ministry site and read these documents, to both NATO and the United States to say what you need to do to avoid war. And they actually look like treaties. They're all ready to be signed. But for the one that went to the United States, it focuses on these aspects. And the first one is shared with NATO. But the promise not to extend NATO anywhere eastward, and that includes former Soviet countries, which would include, of course, Ukraine. It would also, in theory, include Sweden and Finland, which have started to toy with joining NATO as Russia has become more aggressive. We have said no to that. Just straight up no. Countries get to decide if they join NATO. NATO gets to decide if they'll accept those countries. Russia cannot make that decision. The other things that Russia has called on are that things like nuclear weapons, bombers, long, intermediate and short-range missiles must stay in one's national territory. And by one, this is between US and Russia, that means American territory. And so we would have to withdraw any nuclear weapons that we might have in Europe, and we have about 100 in countries like Belgium and Germany and Italy and Turkey. We need to withdraw those back to the United States under this treaty. We would not be allowed to fly our bombers over European territory. And of course, we have a lot of bombers based in Europe, and we would not be able to establish missiles and that would include I should say, anti-aircraft missiles, anti-missile missiles systems in NATO countries outside the United States. And so this would basically, remove much of the deterrent power that the United States and NATO have in Europe. And so we have left open discussions on issues like nuclear weapons, including intermediate range nuclear weapons, and other security aspects, but that I'll come back to in a little while. So thinking about the Russian reasons why they are doing this, again, perhaps caveats, all of that kind of thing. But there are clear pieces of evidence that the Russians, and particularly Putin, are deriving their explanation for potentially reintegrating Ukraine from history. In July of this year, or last year, sorry, Putin has a long article talking about this historical unity, and that the Russians and Ukrainians, you can read this as well, are just one people, and that Ukraine is being used just as a tool by the West, and that it should really come to Russia, and therefore it will be happy and sovereign. And so one of the questions, of course, is to what extent is this true? And there are elements of truth to it. And you can read this article. It's on the president's page of the Russian president's page in English, making it nice. But it's a very long discussion of history. And I want to touch on some of these points. So point number one is that there is a basis in this argument. The foundation of Russia, what is traditionally seen as the foundation of Russia, is Kiev and Rus, and Kiev being the capital of Ukraine these days. And so it really starts in what we consider kind of Kiev nowadays, and only later will it move to Russia proper, Nizhny Novgorod, and then Moscow, and eventually St. Petersburg, and then, St. Petersburg, and then back to Moscow. And so it will, move, but it begins in this kind of Ukrainian Russian region. And so there's a lot of harking back to this era. You do have divisions, and Ukraine spends a significant amount of time not within the Russian control. And there you start to get some of these linguistic and other differences. And so starting really in the 16th century, in the 1500s, you get this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In Ukraine, as we think about it today, borders of today are outlined in green on this map. And so at this point, much of Ukraine was actually part of this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which is one of the reasons Ukrainian, according to a colleague in grad school, is actually not too far away from Polish linguistically. And so you have this history for a couple hundred years of being outside any Russian control. Russia begins to gain access to it again, primarily under Catherine the Great. Those are the 1772 to 1795 dates that you're seeing here. And so Russia gains control and holds on to it really until the 20th century, when you get World War I. And at the end of, following the Bolshevik Revolution, in October, November, your preference of dates, of 1917, the Bolsheviks sign an agreement to get out of the war. They sign an agreement with Germany that gives up all of that shaded area to the left of that dotted line. And so much of Ukraine is basically given up, handed over to Germany. Of course, the war ends in technically November of 1918. And so this territory is kind of on its own. You will have a civil war within this territory and between this territory and Russia, the Bolsheviks. You have a civil war simultaneously within all of Russia, really. But Ukraine, much like Poland, is fighting to be independent from a Russian sphere. Russian control. It will lose, and in 1922, the Bolsheviks, the communists, will take over. And so it now becomes part of the USSR. Not happily, but it becomes part of the USSR. And so during this period between 1922 and 1941, really, the part of Ukraine that is kind of pinkish brownish is part of the Soviet Union. And it endures, and from the Ukrainian point of view, enduring is the key term, what is frequently called the Holodomor. This was a period when, in 1932-33, when Stalin was ruling the country, and he was collectivizing the farms, which means he was taking all the farmers from their private plots or shared plots, what have you, and forcing them into collective or state farms. Ukraine, being the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, had a lot of farms, and often very productive farms. And these farmers were forced from their lands into these collective farms. And then much of the grain from the farmers was then exported to the rest of the Soviet Union. So you had mass starvation. Estimated 3 to 5 million people would die during this period of time of a purely man-made famine. And a lot of the Ukrainians remember that and remember it well. Not maybe personally, but passed down from generations. And so there is a lot of anger among many Ukrainians toward Russia for this, and really toward the Soviet Union. But now that Russia is kind of establishing its history and returning to a love of much of the Soviet history as well, this is remembered, and not kindly. So you have a bunch of memorials. This one is in Kiev. There's a similar one actually in Canada, but you have a lot of memorials to this. And so again, the Ukrainians don't necessarily view this history in the same way that Russians do. World War II occurs, and during this war, the Ukrainians, really 1941, after when the Nazis invade, really end up fighting both sides. There are a number of Ukrainians who go inside with the Nazis because of the horrors of Soviet rule. The Nazis turn out to be absolutely no better, so you have this division. So some Ukrainians are fighting on each side. At the end of the war, you do have an uprising and a guerrilla war that will last for a couple of years at fairly high levels. Over 100,000 Ukrainians will be deported for having supported the bandits and rebels. And so again, you have this clash between Russia and Ukraine. Crimea, by the way, is originally, and in this point, right after World War II, still part of Russia. Khrushchev will give Crimea to Ukraine in 1954. So many in Crimea still consider themselves Russian, as opposed to having any identity with Ukraine. And to illustrate this, just to kind of point out a couple of maps, there is this linguistic difference that you saw in that earlier map that showed you Donetsk and Luhansk. And so the darker the blue, the more the Russian speak, or more higher the percentage of Russian speakers you've got. So you can see there's a lot of blue here on the east side, and there are very few Russian speakers on the west side. And that has also transmitted into support for candidates. And so in a variety of elections, you have often you have had pro-Russian versus pro-Western candidates. And so this first one is not, this is a referendum to leave the Soviet Union. But you can see almost everybody wants to leave the Soviet Union except for Crimea. And yet the numbers are higher on the Western side. You will have the same kind of division when we're talking about those candidates. And so in 2004, Yanukovych was seen as pro-Russian, Yushchenko was pro-Western. And so you can see the data here. This is what will lead to the Orange Revolution, which I'll mention later. You have you have other elections that show the same thing. So moving on, because I'm still kind of, not too far out of the Soviet period here, I want to talk about the reasons, thinking about countering encirclement. And this is really getting into security issues. The Russian kind of psyche has long considered itself encircled by enemies. And of course, you have had some reason for that. You had the Mongols invade, you had Napoleon invade, you had the Germans attack a couple of times. And so, there is this sense that we are encircled by enemies. And so, they're perhaps particularly attuned to that kind of thing. We want to couple that too with the understanding of what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I cannot stress how destabilizing, how dislocating for many people this change was, this collapse was. And so when the Soviet Union ends, Russia obviously remains the largest state. It's about half the population of the Soviet Union. It's no longer a superpower. Its economy will tank. For a while, its economy was about the size of that of the Netherlands. Its life expectancy drops, inflation rages 900% at one point, I think it was 1993. And so, everything that identified Russia as this great power is gone, or the Soviet Union as a great power is now gone. And so when Putin, a week or two ago, commented that he had driven a taxi to earn money in the early 90s, that's completely reasonable, because the government could not pay its military, the government could not pay its people. And so it was extremely vulnerable. And so into this period, we of course have NATO expansion. And so NATO, following the end of the Cold War in 1990, expands to include East Germany, when Germany unites in 1990. The dates on this are a little weird, but that's okay. And then 1999, it incorporates Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. And then in the 2000s, it includes other members of the Soviet bloc, of the Warsaw Pact, as well as 3 members of the Soviet Union, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states. And so, if you are Russia, this entity that was created to face you, to counter you, is now not only on the borders of the former Soviet Union, but within the borders, and they're bordering you. And a lot of these states have been used as buffer states to protect Russia against, or the Soviet Union against its enemies. And so now they're part of what many Russians consider an enemy body. There were a lot of individuals, realists, to use the term I talk about in class, that said this was a dumb idea. We should not expand. Expanding will make the Russians feel threatened and will create a security concern when the Russians can face the security concern. There were others that were concerned that this might empower nationalism within Russia. And indeed, to some extent, it has done both. And so many of those critiques, have kind of come to pass, albeit 15 to 20 years later. The argument for expanding is that we want to encourage and enable these new democracies, and the Baltic states are great examples of that, these new democracies to be democratic and to pursue that path. And this is a way of providing them with stability. Now, one of your questions was that came in was whether or not this violates the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Its dictate that no actions from the Helsinki Accords, 1975, that no actions can be done that threaten the security of another state in Europe. And NATO will tell you, and does so on its website, that NATO is a defensive organization. It has no interest in attacking anyone. It is purely for the protection of its members from external aggression. And so NATO sees itself as not projecting a threat. Russia, on the other hand, has long seen it as a threat. And there were critiques from the Russian government in the mid-1990s and later about the potential of expansion. But at that time, they could not really do much to counter it. And so in 2008, the United States pushed its NATO allies to agree to extend potential joining of NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. And those are the 2 countries on the right that you see that are in yellow. Bosnia-Herzegovina is the other one in yellow. And so, this expanded that offer to 2 countries that not only were within Russia or within the Soviet Union, excuse me, but also that the Soviet Union and now Russia has issues with. And so we've got this expansion going on. And if you're Russia, this is kind of what NATO looks like. And so NATO has this sense, even though technically only, according to Fiona Hill, only 6% of Russia's land borders are bordered by NATO countries, Russia has this sense that it is surrounded. And of course, if you then throw in Japan, which is an ally of the United States, you have even more of that region surrounded. So Russia, again, it's from the Russian point of view here. To boot, you have these revolutions that occur in the 2000s. And so they're color revolutions. as they're called. And so you have the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003. You have the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. And you have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, all of which overthrew governments that were seen as corrupt, as authoritarian, and in the Russian case, or in the in the Ukrainian case, as pro-Russian. And so if you are Russia, this does not make you feel secure at all, even more of a kind of circumventing, of an encirclement. And so we move from this revolution to 2014 and the Euromaidan protests. These emerge when the leader of Ukraine, Yanukovych, basically reneges on an agreement with the EU to enhance trade and relations with the EU and instead shift over to Putin, who had offered significant foreign aid and trade opportunities with Ukraine. And so once Yanukovych said, nope, not doing EU, doing Russia, you have these mass protests. The government of Ukraine starts to fire on these protesters, and that brings even more into the streets and increasingly armed into the streets. And so in February, this starts in November of 2013. In February of 2014, Yanukovych flees actually to Russia, and a temporary government comes in, interim government comes in, and they're going to hold elections. The interim government is definitely not pro-Russia, shall we say. And is definitely westward looking toward the EU. And so this kind of instability in Ukraine helps to trigger Russian action. And it triggers it in a couple of ways. Into Crimea in February, Russia will send these little green men. And they're termed little green men because they're all in green and they have no insignia. And so the trucks do not indicate where they are from. The uniforms don't indicate where they are from. You will have some of the same in Luhansk and Donetsk as well. And so you have the surreptitious involvement by what has been pretty well traced by Bellingcat and other sources as Russians, involved in securing, shall we say, Crimea and facilitating the attacks on Ukrainian forces by rebels in Donetsk and Luhansk. In March, the Crimean government declares that it will have elections, and those elections, a referendum about whether or not to join Russia. You have a lot of questionable behavior concerning this election. To what extent is it free? The Tatars boycott a minority population within Crimea. The question is somewhat skewed. There is pressure to vote the right way. And the propaganda is pretty clear to make sure you know which way to vote. So you've got a choice on the 16th of March. We vote. You can choose either fascism or lovely Russia. And so 97% of the population, or 97% of the vote, goes to joining Russia. By the way, by and large, Ukraine recognizes it wants Crimea back, no question, but it recognizes it's not getting it. Most public opinion polls have a significant majority who say, yeah, we know we're not getting it. Not in the short term anyway, maybe long term, but not in the short term. The Luhansk and Donetsk, again, that's one of those kind of semi-frozen conflicts. They continue to fight at low levels, but it really hasn't moved much beyond the borders that they were there in 2015. So this is both a response by Russia to and creates more of the Ukrainian shift toward the West. And so this is exports, the next one is imports, but trade between Ukraine and the EU shoots up, even actually beginning before 2014, and trade with Russia starts to drop. And the invasion of Crimea, the takeover of Crimea, just enhances that. And here's imports. And so you know, in many ways, Ukraine has moved closer to the West More of its candidates who take seats in office in parliament are pro-Western than they were, in large part because those regions like Donetsk and Luhansk do not vote, and Crimea do not vote in Ukrainian elections. You also, of course, have NATO response. So following 2014, for the first time, NATO starts to put battle groups, military units of decent size, in the Baltic states and in Poland. And they are not permanently based there. They float in and out to avoid having permanent basing. But the idea, and we have about 4,500 troops there now, we being NATO, generally speaking, is to deter Russia from attacking any of these countries. And this really came to be because of the attack on Ukraine. So now I just want to shift to kind of the power and opportunities. So recall that, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia loses its status, because Russia was kind of seen as the, basis of the Soviet Union in many ways, as a superpower. It was seen as somebody that could be pushed around. Its economy had declined. It had lost a war against Chechnya, which is roughly the size of Connecticut. And so, Russia was kind of at a nadir, major economic crisis in '98, etc. And so in basically 2000, this guy comes to power, Putin, former KGB officer. We can talk about other things about him if you want, but he comes to power and is very much interested, even that at this time, at reestablishing Russia as an important actor, as relevant. And so he begins slowly, but reinvigorating the military, goes into Chechnya again, this time successfully, and wants to reestablish that country as a great power, as somebody you listen to. Early on, there was little thought that he had much in the way of ideology. It seemed kind of just general. But he has really started to become this advocate for anti-democracy, for anti-liberalism. And as such, within Russia, he has relinked the government to the church, to the Russian Orthodox Church. He has rebuilt some of the cathedrals and churches. He has kind of established faith and trust in history, largely by banning all that is not positive history of Russia. The organization Memorial was just closed. It was formed in the 1980s to find and honor the victims of Stalinism. And so that has been closed down. Other critiques have been closed down. He has been, very critical of foreign ideas about LGBT issues and other things. And so, that has strengthened. Russia is a fairly conservative country, and so strengthens his support within his country, and also has garnered him allies and friends, I should say, more than allies, abroad. And Viktor Orban of Hungary, who was just there yesterday or the day before in Russia, is a great case in point. Here is a guy who is actually a reformer back at the end of communist control of Hungary, and has now become kind of the poster child for anti-liberalism within the EU. And so not only do the two kind of feed off each other in terms of support and power, but for Putin, Orban, as well as the leaders of Poland, and until a recent election in Czech Republic there, have really managed to create some rifts within the European Union. And so, this kind of leader as anti-liberal has, forwarded his stance. That, of course, has been helped by other trends in the world. So we've got Brexit. You want to weaken EU even more. You have the UK leaving. You have, generally speaking, a decline by most analyses of democracy in the world. And so the number of countries that are democratic is declining. The level of democracy in many, including the United States, has been seen as declining. And so if you are Putin and arguing that democracy is useless and a waste, this all kind of goes to your position. And then, of course, you have the Trump administration, who by, and large was as friendly with Putin as you could be, even though Congress very much pushed the Trump administration, pretty bipartisan, on a bipartisan approach, to sanction and increase sanctions against Putin. But you have an administration who by and large tried to refute the strong evidence of Russian interference in the 2016 elections, of other Russian actions. You have a leader who tried to use Ukraine as a kind of patsy. You also have a leader, even more so, that undermined American credibility by being very hesitant to say we would defend our NATO allies, to reassert Article 5, which is an attack on one is an attack on all. And so this was seen very much as kind of lowering American credibility and trustworthiness. Further lowering American trustworthiness in many people's eyes is the pretty rapid, semi-haphazard pullout from Afghanistan. And that pullout, done with limited interaction with our allies, done in a way that, of course, put an awful lot of Afghans who had supported us in significant danger, was seen as illustrating a couple of things. Number one, the weakness of the United States. And number two, the lack of will of the United States. We're not going to want to get into any of these conflicts again. And so, will the US be willing to suffer any pain for anybody is a key question here. And so you've got that kind of opportunity to this door that you can walk through, this door of credibility, you could say. You also have, over the course of the Putin administration, a significant amount of strengthening itself in particularly two realms. One is economic. So following the 2014 sanctions that were put on place because of the Ukrainian activity, Putin has done a couple of things within Russia. First, focused on import substitution. So Russia builds more of its own stuff, and so makes more of its own cheese. It banned European cheese, and does similar things. So it can protect its own population from a limited trade, limited imports. It has also gained one of the largest amounts of foreign reserve currency, or foreign currency reserve, in the world. It has over $630 billion. Only a small percentage of that is in dollars. So it has euros and renminbi and other currencies that it can use to trade, is the idea. So it's tried to defend itself against more sanctions or other economic effects. It is also really focused on strengthening its military. And so while it won in Chechnya in the early 2000s, while it easily defeated Georgia in 2008, those both pointed out a whole lot of weaknesses. And so the Russian military has been strengthened technologically. It has been strengthened monetarily. Its training and personnel have been improved. It's moved from a mostly conscript army to a mostly contract army. So people are, volunteers, more or less, and a variety of other efforts to strengthen its capacity. And a lot of that was seen in Syria, when most of its pilots have combat experience, having engaged in Syria. And that was an opportunity to test out a lot of weaponry, also some ground weaponry as well, but to a lesser extent. So Russia has improved domestically. Another area that benefits Russia is China. And Putin's on his way to the PRC to meet with Xi Jinping. Xi and Putin agree that, being anti-American is a good thing, that they want to limit the United States' role and power. And so they very much agree on this. And for Putin, Xi Jinping may be a great source of funding of purchasers if Europe were to cut off those gas supplies and those oil supplies and say, nope, we can get it from somewhere else. I'll come back to that in just a sec. The one thing that we do also know is that Xi would not be happy if Russia started a war during the Olympics, because nobody's going to watch the Olympics. And so we probably have until the end of the Olympics to think, if Russia is really thinking about a serious invasion, that would occur. I mentioned the gas thing. This is another piece of power for Russia, is this reliance that the European Union countries have on Russian oil and gas. And Germany's reliance is actually increased because it's closing down its nuclear power facilities. And so you have a significant portion of imports from Russia. And that Nord Stream 2, which no doubt you guys have all heard of, is designed to A, bypass Ukraine, which is where the word Slovakia is, and B, of course, get more gas to Germany. And so this is one of the reasons that Germany may be a little more hesitant to counter Russia than are countries that are less reliant, like France or the UK, or that are more at risk, like Poland and the Baltic states, all of which have been very vocal in wanting to support Ukraine. Germany is also affected, and I say this because one of the questions was about Germany. Germany is also affected by its traditional anti-militaristic point of view. It does not want to provide arms to an active war zone. And that's why it's just recently told Estonia it cannot send German-made arms to Ukraine. And it has also often been kind of that bridge ever since Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik to Russia, to the Soviet Union at that time. And so it's trying to play this middle game. But Germany may be irked more than normal because Russia has just banned Deutsche Welle from functioning in Russia. So we will see what happens. So what are our options and should we care? And I want to hit that first because a couple of the questions were concerning that. And my response, and this is just my personal opinion, is that yes, we should care. And we should care for a variety of reasons. Number one, we have worked with Ukraine since 1991 or so. We've funneled billions of dollars into Ukraine, as have our allies, to help it democratize, counter corruption and the like. Number two, it is a democracy. It is a, it is a problematic democracy. It is a democracy affected by a lot of corruption, but it is a democracy that is actually moving in the right direction. If you like democracy, which personally I do. Number three, it has shown itself to be a country that wants to participate with the United States. It sent troops, not a lot, but troops to Afghanistan to assist us there. It has been there to the extent it can, to assist the United States. And number three, I would say credibility issues. These big realist arguments that we need to show that a country that we have sent weapons to, that we have sent trainers to, we have sent Americans to help train Ukrainians in warfighting, that we will stand by them when things get tough. Does that mean we go to war for them? No. We'll come back to that. But that credibility is not just about Russia and Ukraine, it's also about other issues, perhaps most notably Taiwan. And so while those two issues are not directly linked by any means, other countries watch what we do. And so just like that pullout from Afghanistan may have been one of those things that told Putin, hey, I can get away with this. Not doing anything about Ukraine might tell China, hey, I can get away with this. So what are our options? We've got a ton of options that we can look at. And so we could send troops to Ukraine and fight there. A slight minority of the United States in a summer of 2021 poll supported that idea. But again, slight minority. Basically, that is not going to happen. We've taken that really off the shelf, off the table, because we don't want to go to war with Russia. Simple as that. And I would argue that's a logical thing. I'm going to flip to the bottom one as well and say do nothing, because I always tell my students doing nothing is an option. But for the reasons I just gave, I would take that off the table, and it looks like the US government has too. And so we can kind of remove those options. These other options, we are doing pretty much all of them. And so we are providing arms and some training to Ukraine. Those arms are generally defensive. They can't be used to attack Russia, not effectively anyway. The British are also doing this. They're sending a lot of weaponry to Ukraine, and a lot of trainers have gone to Ukraine to help. So that is in process. And again, the idea there is not that that would stop a Russian invasion, that would suddenly give them all capacity, but that it would deter it in the first place. We have economic sanctions against Russia. I'm going to come back to, well, no, I'll talk about that right now. We can have economic sanctions, and there are a variety of kinds. One of the questions asked about SWIFT, which is the bank-to-bank transfer system. Would that work? So that would basically keep Russia from being able to transfer money between banks anywhere in the world. That requires multilateral agreement. And so that's probably going to be hard to get all those other countries, notably Germany, who is a little tentative right now, to agree to that. But we can do I think it's called dollar clearing. We can use the dollar clearing effort, which means basically that the Russians cannot function in the US dollar. And so we can ban those transactions, which would mean they don't get any money from their oil and natural gas, because all of those sales, almost all of those sales worldwide, are done in the dollar. And so that's about 40% of their revenue. And so they would feel that. But so would any countries who are buying oil and natural gas and not doing it kind of under the table, so to speak. We can enhance security and resilience of NATO states. We are doing that now. That's the 3,000 troops that President Biden mentioned are being sent to Europe. Well, not some of them are already in Europe, but sent to Eastern Europe, to the Baltic states, to Poland. There's talk within NATO of sending several thousand more to the other states that the other NATO states that border Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, is not a member of NATO. We are under no obligation whatsoever to defend it. Article 5, that attack on one is an attack on all, does not hold to potential members. So there's no obligation to defend it. That was a question. And then last is diplomacy and negotiations. And of course, that is what is being done pretty broadly, is that there is a lot of diplomacy. We saw the United Nations Security Council talk about this. The Russians tried to shut the discussion down, but they were outvoted. It was a vote of 10 for discussion out of 15. And so the discussion ensued. We are also doing significant private conversations at a variety of levels between us, between NATO diplomats and Russian equivalents. And so there's a lot of negotiation. What we basically said is that we will not bend on the can Ukraine eventually someday maybe join, but the point is that we don't expect them to join soon. And we made that pretty clear. Biden made that pretty clear. We're also of open negotiations on, and said they can be open on issues like nuclear weapons, security more broadly in Europe, those kind of issues we are open to, but we're not going to limit state sovereignty and right to join NATO, or NATO's right to decide who gets to join. Putin's response, the flag in the middle is the Hungarian flag, because Orban was just visiting him. Putin just spoke yesterday or the day before, and said that, negotiating on those things is fine, but the United States is still ignoring, and NATO is still ignoring the serious security concerns that Russia has. So I'm going to end there because we have like no time at all. But for any questions, I can get in the next few minutes. So thank you very much. And please, if you have questions.
Andrea, we've got a few. I don't know that we'll get to them all, but let me raise a couple of them. And for former students who want to know, I'm trying to cut and paste so that she knows who they came from, but I won't necessarily say your name here, but Dr. Lopez will know who's asking questions, so she can give you a gold star. Interesting question. Has there been an official Ukrainian response to Putin's statement for Russian-Ukrainian unity?
Ooh, hey, Mary Beth. The answer is I don't know. I have not seen one. And Ukraine is in kind of a weird spot there, so that on the one hand, there is the Minsk agreement, and the Minsk agreement is the agreement, it was a kind of multilateral agreement about stopping the conflict in Luhansk and Donetsk. And what it basically said is that Ukraine needs to give significant autonomy to these regions, let them kind of run their own thing, but also be in parliament in Kiev. And the Ukrainians have been a little hesitant to agree to that because that could undermine, and basically it also agrees to something about joining Western organizations, so limits that ability. And so Ukraine, on the one hand, is hesitant about dealing with just even Ukrainian unity. But Ukraine has basically said, we are our own country. whether it's an official response to that statement, I can't tell you, but they have made it clear they believe they're an independent country and have been for 30 years, and so they get the right to be Ukrainian.
Okay. Another question here, what does the Ukraine conflict mean for Russia's ambitions in the Caucasus?
Not really sure it means a whole lot. And I say that because in the Caucasus region, where you have Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia has basically cowed Georgia in many ways by largely taking over the South Ossetia and Abkhazia and making them largely autonomous. And in fact, they've declared independence. About 4 countries have recognized them, including Russia. You have Armenia and Azerbaijan, who have their own wars between each other. Where I would say it might matter is the role of Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally, has just visited or is visiting Ukraine to show support, has provided Ukraine with drones and other technology. But it supports Azerbaijan while Russia supports Armenia. And so you have potentially the kind of transition of issues between those 2 regions.
Okay. I'm trying to scan through here. Okay, well, there's a big one that probably other people might have. So I'm going to ask, is nuclear warfare a possibility?
Yes, and I mean, yes, it is always a possibility. And Russia, I shouldn't say always, but Russia has made its nuclear policy fairly, nuclear use policy fairly flexible, that any threat to its security could be met. It's a little bit more nuanced, but not much, could be met with nuclear weapons. Do I think it's likely? No. I think it's very unlikely that there would be nuclear war, for the same reason that there was that neither the Soviets nor the Americans wanted nuclear war, is that you are going to lose, both of you, all of you, and so there's no benefit to Russia. But does it want to keep that threat in the back of its hand to deter us from action, or anybody else? Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Thinking about Russia's motivation here, what is your assessment of the report that Russia is transporting blood reserves to the region?
That is one, yeah, I've heard that too. That is one of those that is a concerning one, because you do, there could be 3 arguments. One is that they're just having blood shortages generally in the population. I don't know one way or the other. Number 2 is that they plan to do aggressive war games and so have some injuries. I don't know. But 3 is the obvious, is that you need blood reserves if you're planning to have, if you expect to have a bunch of casualties. And so that the mobilization of number of its National Guardsmen, which are not dissimilar to ours, those both provide concerns. And that is one of the reasons that a lot of analysts are, kind of nervous about Russia's intents here.
Has Ukraine asked the USA and NATO for help in this recent escalation? Has there been a?
Yes. Now, that does not mean troops. They have been pretty explicit that they do not want foreign troops in their country, except for some trainers and the like. But yes, they have very explicitly asked for more weapons. They have asked for more assistance. One of the questions referenced a snarky response by Ukraine to Germany about, Germany sent them helmets, which is lovely. And the response was, are you going to send us pillows next? Because they want guns and bullets. They don't want helmets. They've got helmets. So, but they do want assistance, just not physical troops on the ground kind of assistance.
Okay. And the UN discussion that happened this week, what was the effect of that discussion?
The effect is political. It's not military. It's not strategic, but it was the attempt to try to get Russia to explain why it's doing what it's doing. And Russia basically said it wasn't doing anything wrong. And apparently the Russian ambassador left before the Ukrainian, or as the Ukrainian ambassador was about to speak, which is signal. And so for those countries who are, kind of on the fence, that may sway them one way or the other. Not that they're going to necessarily be doing things, but public opinion on a global scale can have an effect.
Okay. Does the recent uprising in Kazakhstan have anything to do with a more aggressive Russia?
It is the first time that the CSTO, which is the kind of the former Soviet Union's version of NATO, kind of, it's a defensive organization, military organization. First time it's deployed troops. It does show the greater willingness to use troops, but it also shows the concern that Russia has about Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan's long been considered really stable. It is a very large, geographically speaking country. It's got a whole lot of oil and natural gas and stuff. And so keeping that stable is pretty important to Russia.
Okay. There's more questions here, and I apologize. If we went through all of them, we would be here till midnight. So I think I'm going to let one of our more senior alums here, thank you, Bill Lewis, ask the kind of takeaway question for you to offer what you want to offer, Andrea. And it's what do you think is going to happen given all of your expertise?
I have no idea. I know that's helpful. But to be honest, I don't. I think what we're seeing is in some of Putin's statements yesterday, day before, I think it was Tuesday, actually, that he is kind of being a little more accommodating and maybe being willing to kind of step back in some ways and looking for an out. He was stressing that, Russia is not looking for conflict. Russia is not being aggressive. It's the Americans, really, because he focuses on us more than anybody else, the Americans who are driving us to war. And so if you can convince everybody of that, then stepping back and not going to war shows that you were not driven to that bad outcome. And so one could argue that this is opening a door. What I will say is that war is going to be good for no one, particularly Ukraine, obviously, but also particularly bad for Russia. I think it would be economically damaging. I think, you would see NATO unite even more than it has. And one of the things that every time the Russians get aggressive, NATO comes together a little better. So thank you for giving us a purpose again. And so, I think Putin's probably going to continue to harass, continue to annoy, continue to do all the kind of sub rosa stuff he does with cyber attacks and political undermining and things, but I think he's going to try to back away from war. But I have been wrong before.
Not in my memory. Not in my memory. I want to thank everybody. There's no doubt that everybody would like to continue to take your classes, Andrea, because there's lots of people who still have lots of questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all tonight. Maybe have to have you back another time for this, see what's happening. And it's been my pleasure to be a part of this.